The funeral was held 3 days later beneath a cloudy Appalachian sky. Neighbors, church friends, and longtime customers gathered to pay their respects to the woman who had spent her life serving others. Sage stood quietly beside the casket, listening to the preacher's words, but her thoughts were elsewhere. She thought about the countless evenings spent beside her grandmother at the workbench, the lessons, the stories, the laughter, the sacrifices. Now all of it felt painfully distant. For the first time in her life, Sage Josephine Honaker truly understood what loneliness felt like. Yet even in her grief, she found reasons to be grateful. Her grandmother had left her something far more valuable than money. She had left her a trade. In a world where most women depended upon a husband or father to survive, Sage possessed skills that few women in America could claim. She could repair watches. She could restore clocks. She could engrave fine pieces for wealthy customers and major retailers. She could manage accounts, oversee shipments, and operate a respected business on her own. Everything she knew had been taught to her by the woman now resting before her. As the final prayer was spoken and mourners slowly drifted away, Sage remained standing beside the grave. Her heart was broken. But she knew one thing. Her grandmother had prepared her to meet the world alone, and for that she would always be thankful. After the funeral, the house felt strangely quiet. The visitors had gone home. The meals left by neighbors sat untouched in the kitchen. Even the old clock seemed to tick softer than before. For hours, Sage wandered through the rooms, touching familiar things and fighting back tears. Then her eyes settled on the old trunk resting in the corner. The trunk, the one her grandmother had spoken of only hours before her passing. Slowly, Sage pulled the trunk out onto the bedroom floor and knelt beside it. This trunk had traveled through decades of family history. It had belonged to her grandparents. It had witnessed joy, hardship, love, and loss. Taking a deep breath, Sage opened the lid. Inside were treasures her grandmother had carefully preserved through the years. Photographs, letters tied neatly with ribbon, church bulletins, receipts from long ago, small keepsakes that held meaning only to the person who had saved them. Each item told a story. Each item carried a memory. Then, tucked carefully beneath folded clothing, Sage discovered something that immediately caught her attention. A pocket watch, beautifully crafted, the finest work she had ever seen. Her grandfather had made it especially for her grandmother on their 25th wedding anniversary. The silver case still gleamed despite the passing years. Sage carefully opened it. Inside rested a folded note. The handwriting was unmistakably her grandfather's. With trembling hands, she unfolded the paper and began to read. "My dearest Elizabeth, if these words find you years from now, know that loving you was the greatest blessing God ever granted me. No success, no money, and no accomplishment could ever compare to the life we built together. Should our grandchildren one day read this letter, tell them that character matters more than wealth, faith matters more than popularity, and family matters more than all the gold in Montana. If trouble ever finds them, may they have the courage to seek truth, the wisdom to recognize it, and the strength to follow where it leads. All my love, your loving husband." By the time she finished reading, tears were running down Sage's cheeks. She had never known her grandfather, yet somehow, in those few handwritten lines, she felt closer to him than ever before. Little did she know, buried deeper inside the trunk, were papers that would soon change the course of her entire life. Sage was still gripping the anniversary watch of her grandmother's, and suddenly, by accident, her thumb was on the inside of the watch, as it was still open from reading and a false bottom slid open. She saw a tiny piece of paper tucked inside what was meant to be a secret chamber. Sage unfolded the tiny scrap of paper hidden behind the watch's silver backing. Only 3 numbers were written on it, 317. She stared at them for a long moment. She had no idea what they meant, but deep inside, she knew they mattered. Somewhere in Montana, those 3 numbers were waiting to tell a story. Suddenly, an old photograph caught her eye. Her curiosity was at peak level. She had never seen inside this trunk before. Her grandmother guarded it, and it was never opened in her presence. Her grandmother had owned this chest all her life. She remembered clearly how it was guarded with intensity. Sage carefully lifted a couple of old photographs from the bottom of the trunk. The edges were worn with age. She had never seen these in her life. For a long moment, she simply stared. There stood her grandmother, Standing on a train platform in Bristol, Tennessee, a main train stop close to Honaker, Virginia, and in the doorway near her stood a little blonde-haired girl no more than 4 or 5 years old, Sage. The photograph had captured a moment she could not remember, yet somehow it felt familiar deep inside her soul. As she studied the image, realization slowly settled over her. This was the day her grandfather came home. Not alive. The second photograph was her grandmother watching them unload her husband's casket from the train. He was no longer alive. Not with stories of Montana's gold camps, not with dreams of a brighter future. He had come home in a coffin. The train behind them had carried his body all the way from Virginia City, Montana, back to the mountains of Virginia where he would be laid to rest. Sage looked at the tiny child standing beside her grandmother and felt an ache in her chest. That little girl had no understanding of death, no understanding of murder, no understanding of why the strongest man in the family had suddenly disappeared from their lives. But her grandmother knew. The grief on her face could still be seen in the photograph decades later. The waiting. The heartbreak. The finality of watching that coffin arrive. Sage ran her fingers gently across the image. Her grandmother had kept this photograph all those years, not because it brought comfort, but because it was the last journey J. Philip Honaker ever made. A journey from the wild mountains of Montana back to the family that loved him. And now, sitting alone in the quiet house, Sage understood something she had never fully realized before. Her grandmother had carried that grief every day of her life, and perhaps that was why she had saved every article, every letter, and every photograph connected to his death, because she never stopped loving him, and she never stopped wondering who took him away. Now those questions belonged to Sage. For the first time, she understood that this journey to Montana wasn't just about solving a mystery. It was about finishing a story that had been left unfinished for decades. A story her grandmother had carried in silence. A story her grandfather never got the chance to tell. And somewhere deep inside, Sage felt certain that the answers were still waiting for her, waiting in Montana. Sage sat silently at the table as the oil lamp flickered beside her. The old newspaper trembled slightly in her hands. All her life she had heard whispers about her grandfather's death, family stories, fragments of conversations, questions no one could answer. But this was different. This was real. This was the actual newspaper that people in Montana had held in their hands the morning after he was killed. Her eyes moved slowly across the headline. Philip Honaker, found dead. Local gunsmith murdered. No arrests have been made. The words struck her harder than she expected. For years she had imagined some explanation would eventually surface, some witness, some confession, some clue that would bring peace to the family. Instead, she found only unanswered questions. The sheriff believed foul play. The townspeople believed foul play. The newspaper believed foul play. Yet somehow the killer had vanished into history. No arrest, no trial, no justice, no answers. As Sage stared at the article, a feeling she had carried since childhood began rising inside her once again. She wanted to know why. Why had her grandfather been killed? Who had wanted him dead? And what had happened inside that Montana gun shop on the night he never came home? The questions had haunted her grandmother for decades. Now they haunted her. For the first time, the mystery no longer felt like a distant family story. It felt personal. And somewhere deep inside, Sage began to wonder if the truth might still be waiting to be found. The following week found Sage exactly where she had been nearly every day of her life, standing behind the counter of Honaker Gunsmith and Clockworks. Orders were stacked on the workbench. Several watches awaited engraving. A shipment destined for New York City still needed to be packed before the afternoon wagon departed. Normally, work was enough to keep her mind occupied, but not this week. Not since she had discovered the newspaper articles hidden in her grandmother's trunk. No matter how hard she tried to focus, her thoughts kept drifting west, to Montana, to Virginia City, to her grandfather, to the unanswered questions that had haunted her family for decades. More than once she found herself staring out the shop window, wondering what she should do. Then the bell above the door rang. Sage looked up. The gentleman from Baltimore had returned. His wife walked beside him, smiling politely as they stepped inside. Before Sage could greet them, the man reached into his coat and removed a folded document. A formal offer, an offer to purchase the shop. For a moment, nobody spoke. Sage simply stared at the paper in his hand. Only a few weeks earlier, she would have refused without hesitation. This shop was her family's legacy, the business her grandfather had built, the business her grandmother had sacrificed to preserve, the business she herself had worked tirelessly to keep successful. Yet now everything felt different. Since discovering the truth about her grandfather's death, she could think of little else. Day after day, the idea returned. Sell the shop, go west, find the answers. The gentleman gently placed the document into her hands. As Sage looked down at the offer, a strange feeling settled over her, almost as if events were unfolding exactly as they were supposed to, almost as if God had quietly opened a door she never expected to walk through. The offer was fair, more than fair. It would provide enough money for her journey, enough to begin again if necessary, and enough to ensure she would not be forced to return home empty-handed. She looked up at the couple standing before her, then back down at the offer. For the first time, she found herself seriously considering the possibility that her future might not be in Virginia at all. Perhaps her future was waiting somewhere in Montana, waiting beside an old mystery, waiting beside a grandfather she had never known, waiting beside answers that had remained hidden for nearly 30 years. After several sleepless nights and many long conversations with herself, Sage finally made her decision. She would sell. The following week passed quickly. The attorney prepared the paperwork. The buyers arranged the transfer of funds. Inventory was counted. Records were reviewed. And before Sage fully realized it, the day of closing had arrived. That morning she walked down Main Street toward the attorney's office, just a short distance from Honaker Gunsmith and Clockworks. The familiar building seemed different somehow. For years she had walked those same sidewalks, passed the same storefronts, greeted the same people, yet she knew things were changing, perhaps forever. Inside the attorney's office, the buyers were already waiting. The gentleman from Baltimore greeted her warmly, while his wife offered a reassuring smile. Both seemed genuinely pleased that an agreement had finally been reached. The attorney carefully reviewed each document, explaining every detail before placing the papers in front of Sage. For a moment, she stared at them. Those pages represented more than a business transaction. They represented the end of one chapter of her life and the beginning of another. Taking a deep breath, Sage picked up the pen. One signature, then another. Within minutes, ownership of Honaker Gunsmith and Clockworks officially passed into new hands. The shop her grandfather had built, the shop her grandmother had preserved, the shop that had supported 3 generations of the Honaker family. It no longer belonged to her. Surprisingly, Sage felt neither sadness nor regret. Instead, she felt something she had not experienced in quite some time. Hope. Because every signature carried her one step closer to Montana, one step closer to Virginia City, and one step closer to discovering what had truly happened to Philip Honaker all those years ago. As the final papers were gathered and the attorney shook everyone's hand, Sage quietly glanced out the office window toward the mountains beyond town. Her future no longer lay in Virginia. It was waiting somewhere in Montana. From the attorney's office, the small group walked together down Main Street toward the First National Bank of Honaker. The spring sunshine felt warm against Sage's face as she carried a mixture of emotions she could hardly sort through. Relief, sadness, excitement, fear. Everything she had known was changing. Inside the bank, the manager had already prepared the necessary documents. The buyers sat across from Sage while final records were reviewed and account balances verified. For years, every dollar that passed through Honaker Gunsmith and Clockworks had represented long days, tired evenings, and generations of hard work. Her grandfather had built the business. Her grandmother had saved it. And Sage herself had spent countless hours behind those counters keeping it alive. Now, the value of all those years sat before her in black ink on official bank papers. When the banker finally slid the payment across the table, the room grew strangely quiet. Sage looked down at the check. It was more money than she had ever personally possessed. Not merely money, freedom, opportunity, a chance to start over, a chance to travel west, a chance to learn the truth. As the banker completed the transfer and the funds were placed securely into her account, Sage realized there was no turning back now. The shop was sold, the papers were signed, the money had changed hands. For the first time in her life, Every road ahead was her own to choose. And every one of those roads pointed toward Montana, toward Virginia City, toward the mystery that had haunted the Honaker family for decades. Somewhere beyond those mountains and mining camps waited the answers she had spent her entire life wondering about. Now, at last, she had both the means and the courage to go find them. The shop was sold. The papers were signed. The money had been deposited into her account. Sage sat on the porch by the lamplight that night, ready for a brand new future. For the first time in her life, Sage Josephine Honaker had no reason to remain in Honaker, Virginia, except memories. And memories alone could not answer the questions that had haunted her family for decades. Come back for part 3? When Sage packs her things, buys her train tickets to her future, a future waiting for her in Montana,